Hey, welcome back, Sheepdogs. So I realized in my previous videos, I've been mentioning photography about 100 times. So before we get into the actual development of our practical exercises, I want to take a moment and we need to talk about everything about the principles of investigative photography. So with that, let's go. So throughout my lectures, I often get asked, what are the best references that I can get, that covers the topic. And if I had to pick, I would pick Duncan and Robinson's books. Some of the stuff that I talk about is covered more in depth inside their books, and they're just two good references to have if you ever have questions when you're in the field or later on in life when you forget some stuff. So the vast majority of the examples that I have in this lecture revolve around the D5500. It's probably the camera I spent the most time on, and I loved it so much I even bought my own. So I used this for since about 2016 when I finally got my hands on it. It came out in 2015, and it was pretty good. It had 24 megapixels. It shot in HD video. The shutter speed was like 1 in 4,000 to 30 seconds, which was fantastic for any type of photography that I wanted to do. But if I had to choose, I would probably do the D500 now, which is about $1,600 on Amazon last time I checked. It has about 21 megapixels, shoots in 4K video, and the shutter speed is getting a little bit better, and it shoots at 1 in 8,000 to 30 seconds. So it's pretty dang good. And the DSLR simply means that it's a digital single lens reflex camera, and that allows you to interchange lenses on the same body camera. So it allows me to take a macro lens and then switch it over to like a 300 or anything that I'm working with. So I recommend the D500 if I had the money to spend. Now there's a couple camera modes that I want to go over, and the first one is manual. This mode allows you to give full control to the photographer. The more you practice, the more you'll feel a lot more comfortable taking the camera off auto and using manual. But please do not do this until you have practiced enough. Remember, you only have oftentimes one chance at the scene, or with the victim, or even the subject. So don't mess it up, or people will suffer because you're an idiot. Now, auto is something I wish I would have stressed more often when I was like the special agent in charge and so forth, because I realized that not everybody is passionate and tenacious when it comes to a part of their job, and that's photography. So auto is useful for most situations, but it will limit the depth of field, but generally it is the best option because it limits the amount of user error involved. My pet peeve is when an agent or a police officer comes back from a scene or with a victim and they're blurry photographs and they just don't either care or they just didn't know how to fix it. And that would just cause me to have an aneurysm because I realized that we have lost our opportunity and now we have a blurry photograph that we can't use in court. So A is aperture priority. It allows you to select the f-stop and then the camera selects the shutter speed. It's really good for critical comparison photography when you want to use a certain f-stop. But I recommend that when you use this mode, please use a tripod. And S is shutter priority. It allows the user to select the shutter speed, and then the camera selects the other settings. It's pretty good for a variety of different types of crime scene photographs. It allows you to maximize depth of field, and it can limit the camera shake by selecting the proper shutter speed. Program, I don't really want to talk about this too much, but basically you can select either the f-stop or the shutter speed, and the camera selects the other stuff. But it provides a large error rate for inexperienced users, so please practice before you even think about putting on P. Thank you. Now, there are 3 cardinal rules to forensic photography. That is exposure, focus, and composition. Exposure. What is exposure? Exposure is the amount of light used to capture the photograph. So what controls exposure? As you can see here, ambient light, the ISO, aperture, which is the f-stop, shutter speeds, and exposure compensation dials. The ambient light is any light you did not bring to the crime scene. It is known as available light. It's any light that you haven't set up yourself. This includes natural light or even pre-existing lighting built in and around the location where the scene is located. The ambient exposure is controlled by the f-stop and the shutter speed. Those are some examples. ISO sensitivity settings. ISO stands for the International Organization for Standardization. It's an organization that sets international standards for all different kinds of measurements. But when it comes to the reference of your camera, the ISO is your camera sensitivity to light. ISO displayed in a number like 100, 200, or 400. As you can see here, I typically choose between 1 to 400 because I don't lose quality inside of my photographs. So why would you want to change your ISO? Well, you can change it to add or reduce light when needed, or when the lighting conditions are bad, like cloudy, poor indoor lighting, or night photographs. As I said before, as a general rule, ISOs between 100 to 400 are usually effective. For crime scene photography, try to keep the ISOs between 200 on the outside and 400 on the inside. The aperture. The diaphragm controls the amount of light that penetrates through the lens. The control dial on an DSLR camera determines the diameter size of the diaphragm in a lens. The relative size opening of the diaphragm is called the aperture. So the best thing to remember is that the larger the number, the smaller the hole, compared to the smaller the number, the larger the hole. And that affects how much light is coming in. At least on the D5500, you can change the f-stop by using the touchscreen on the back of the camera. Here's some further examples of the f-stop. As you can see, as I take the f-stop and move it up, the depth of field comes more into focus. But if I don't want the background to have any attention, I lower the f-stop. Shutter speeds, they control the amount of light that passes through the camera body using time, and they can be controlled by the photographer. There's a couple options on the shutter speed. When you see the bulb option, it allows the shutter to stay open as long as the photo button is pressed. Usually when we paint with light, which is not covered in this lecture, but you can look it up or buy one of the books. It allows you to take a completely dark scene and make it completely light, like it's totally daylight outside. It's fantastic. The number with the quotation is the number of seconds the shutter stays open. For example, 30 in quotation is 30 seconds. The number alone is the fraction of seconds. So 2 is 1/2 second and 60 is 1/60th second. So what is the slowest shutter speed you should use to handhold your camera? It's somewhat of a trick question I used to ask because of the population I was teaching at the time. The most popular macro lens that we had was a 60 millimeter, and the most popular regular lens was the ranged from like 200 millimeter. So it really depended on the camera that they had. The basic rule that I had was anything less than 1/60th, please do not put it on a tripod. However, here is a better chart that assists in explaining the slowest shutter speed based on your lens length. When hand-holding the camera, don't use a shutter speed slower than the focal length of your lens. However, you may use a shutter speed that's faster than the focal length. The shutter speed also controls motion. The shutter determines how much motion is to be stopped. The higher the number, the faster the motion that can be stopped. So as I mentioned before, remember the D500 has 1/8,000th of a second, which is pretty dang fast. So the basic rules, like a person walking is 125, person running 250, slow moving a car is 1 in 500, a fast moving car is 1 in 1,000, and a propeller airplane is 1 in 2,000. So there's an example of a plane that has its prop stopped due to the shutter speed. That's only 1 in 2,000. Imagine 1 in 8,000. That'd be great. So exposure compensation on a camera is the plus and minus button on the camera. It allows light to be added or subtracted from the photograph without altering the f-stop, shutter speed, or ISO. You can control the exposure composition in manual mode by adjusting the light meter. It does not function when in automatic or manual modes. It works in A, S, and P modes. Here's some examples of what it means to manipulate the exposure composition. Focus. There are two main principles: properly focusing the camera and ensuring proper depth of field. So properly focusing the camera is that autofocus is effective for most crime-free photography. It takes time to allow the camera to focus a little bit. It has difficulty with solid color backgrounds, and sometimes it's difficult in close-up photography. In manual, it's good for white backgrounds. You know the difference between the zoom and the focus ring. Make sure both lens and camera are on the same setting. You can see I circled it, so if it's on automatic or manual, you just flip the little switch on the lens itself to make sure that you're not destroying the little motors when you start twisting it. And oftentimes I use manual, especially on a critical comparison, because it's a lot easier for me to make sure that my photographs are crisp and clear, because I can zoom in on manual, zoom in all the way to the very top, maximum allowed depth, and then take the photograph, and then back out and see it's crystal clear. The depth of field is the amount of photograph from the foreground to the background that is in focus. The depth of field is controlled directly through the aperture or f-stop. So there's three things that control the depth of field. Aperture size, which is defined by the size of opening through which light can enter the camera. Aperture sizes ranges from the widest, which is f1.4, to the smallest range, f and 32. The second one is lens focal length. And the focal length of the lens is the distance between the lens and the image sensor when the subject is in focus, usually stated in millimeters, like 28, 50, 100, etc. In the case of zoom lenses, both the maximum and minimum focal lengths are stated. For example, 18 to 55. And lastly, the third one is lens to subject distance. Distance to a subject refers to the length between the camera and the focus of the image. The closer the camera is to the subject it is focusing on, the narrower the depth of field will be. Inversely, the farther away from the subject is from the camera, the wider the depth of field will be. Composition. There are some rules of the composition. Pay attention to what you're photographing, fill the frame, have a natural perspective from your own eye level because you're the one testifying. I took this photograph from my height, my body, my mind, my soul. And do not ever alter the photographs. So some lens information. This is somewhat subjective because there are many types of macro lenses, but generally, if you can get your hands on a 60mm macro lens, use that for your close-up photography. There are more expensive ones that I recommend, like a 105mm, but 60 is pretty on the cheaper side, the more affordable, I should say, and they do a wonderful job. And if the lens has an OS or a VR, please use it because it reduces the effects of camera shake. And then keep the lens length between 30 and 35mm for evidence establishing shots. It helps reduce diffraction and distortion. It more accurately portrays of spatial relationships. So next we're going to cover the basics of flash photography. These are the topics that I felt that are necessary for you to be extremely proficient at using a flash during your photography. So I've used flash photography a lot in my career because most of our crime scenes are indoors. Very rarely do I have to use it on nighttime unless it's like a traffic accident, but a vast majority of the crimes are committed indoors. And I also recommend that you use a detachable flash, not the stupid built-in small flash on a camera, because it creates funnels. And using a detachable flash allows you to do an off flash, and I use it to do fill flash as well as bounce flash. We'll talk about that here in a second. So there's some general rules. So indoor overall photographs, I usually use an f8. The shutter speed is like 125. I use the TTL, and because it's usually always recommended when you use the TTL. And the photograph should be properly exposed, and if not, you can use the plus or minus on the flash itself. So when you use the plus or minus, as you can see here, you can use the plus or minus, and what this does, it allows you to adjust the power. And here are some examples of using the power. So in my opinion, the -1 in this example is probably the best photograph using the flash. So as I was saying, the off-camera flash is that oftentimes you just can't get a proper exposure if you leave it on top of the camera. So that's why I always take my flash off my camera and then use it to bounce it off or take it from different angles. So that way, when I'm doing, especially my critical comparisons, it really illuminates what I'm trying to photograph. And when you're using a flash, since it's so bright, oftentimes I have to use diffusion. So it's basically you can use like a finger over the flash or a Kleenex. Sometimes I use like a piece of paper or white paper. That way it still goes through the paper, it just is diffused obviously. So you can see two examples of how it washes out the pill bottle, and then when you diffuse it, it lowers the light intensity. Obviously, another way to diffuse or add intensity is to simply move. You can move closer or further away depending upon what you're trying to photograph. And again, just don't take one photograph. If you're unsure, take 50 and then decide which one is the best one. So just don't limit yourself to just one photograph. Just remember that. Bounce flash. I know a lot of photographers use a lot of bounce flash. Sometimes in death scenes, I use a lot of bounce flash because of just how dark it is in the room and there's a lot of shadows. Typically, I use bounce flash off of white walls. It's a lot easier. A lot of military housings had a lot of white in their housing, so it's easy to bounce it off the white. And lastly, field flash. You can kind of see here in the left-hand side, there is a weapon underneath the vehicle. So you use field flash to, it's a technique to get an even exposure in photographs in difficult lighting situations. One of the ways to get even exposure in photographs, as in getting the correct exposure on the subject with a strong backlight, is to use reflectors. In field flash photography, you can use the camera's inbuilt flash or an external flash to fill the underexposed or shadows regions of a photograph. You can also use bulb if you want to. Just put the bulb at a couple seconds and then flash it, and then it'll illuminate all and get rid of all the shadows. It's perfect. Okay, so moving on, let's get down into it. Proper forensic photography is a vital component of any investigation that you do. If photography is a part of your job, especially if you're on a crime scene team, you must have the ability to properly operate cameras beyond using automatic functions. So difficult photographs of evidence, such as fingerprints or fibers illuminated by ALS, can be properly captured. Photography is the most objective manner of documenting a crime scene. Still photography and or video are very useful tools for you to have. There is nothing which can record a crime scene with as much detail as a camera. Photography can be used in court, in questioning suspects, conducting lineups, to refresh memories, and to preserve evidence which otherwise would be lost. Failing to use photography is eliminating one of the most significant tools available to a law enforcement officer. So we're going to do a practical exercise. I want you to pause the video, and I want you to describe a dirty house, which includes like a dirty bathroom, a dirty kitchen, and a dirty refrigerator. Pause the video, write down some notes, and describe to the best of your ability what a dirty bathroom, kitchen, and a refrigerator should look like. So here's an example of a dirty bathroom. Was your description even close? Here's an example of a dirty kitchen. And here's an example of a dirty refrigerator. So the purpose of photography is that photographs are taken to provide an accurate portrayal of the crime scene as you found it when you arrived, in situ. In situ is basically Latin for in the original place. Law enforcement can also take photographs to clarify the written report, going back to look at the photographs to determine whether a witness or a suspect account was accurate, which is sometimes weeks, months, or years later. It creates a permanent record. Photographs supplement crime scene notes and sketches. They can assist with the scene reconstruction. So the previous examples, the photograph tells 1,000 words. So you can try to describe the best you can, but you can't quite get there, but the photograph supplements what you cannot get. And then also, when photographing a crime scene, remember, photographs should be shot at eye level, because you're testifying. You were there. And why take a horizontal and a vertical? Horizontal is, what humans see. We always see in a horizontal view. But I use vertical. I turn the camera right side up because I want to draw specific attention, because it narrows the field. I want to draw a specific attention to what I want the person to look at. Photographs are also used in courtroom. It lets the jury see for themselves. And photographs enhance courtroom testimony. For example, when I was testifying for the 2009 Fort Hood shooting, we were not allowed to use the photographs because of Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 403. They were excluded because they were extreme. They would cause prejudice upon the jury, because seeing a whole bunch of dead bodies, similar to the one here on the example on the right-hand side, all of the egregiousness, it would just create prejudice against the jury towards the offender. So I had to testify on what I saw, what I smelled, what I heard. But again, it doesn't do justice on what a photograph could have done in its place. So in order to get to the photograph accepted into courtroom, you have to follow some rules of evidence. It has to be authentic. That's why I want clear and accurate representation of the scene. That's why we don't want blurry. We want them to be pristine. That's why you have to know what you're doing. They have to be relevant. The evidence, including photographs, that tends to prove or disprove any disputed fact in the case. And it has to be more appropriate than prejudicial. Okay, so moving on to establishing. The purpose of establishing the outside photographs around the scene is to establish specifically where the incident occurred. If you can, try to put the crime scene visible in the photograph when you start establishing and working your way up to the crime scene. Your photograph should slightly overlap, which will document the entire scene. Remember to fill the frame the best that you can. Try not to shoot corners because they cause distortion, and keep the photographs on a plane parallel towards the objects. Here is an outside 360 example. Okay, so when you get to the entrance and exit, make sure that you take an overall photograph as the example shows. But this could have been better, because what I would like is a top, middle, and a bottom picture, because after all, it depends on the megapixels on your camera. So if I want some specific detail on the door or the door frame and I zoom in, if you don't have that very many megapixels, it gets blurry and distorted as you start to zoom in. So take some good photographs of the entry and exits, because that's oftentimes what we use to corroborate or refute a subject or a witness statement. Then as you work your way in, make sure that you stay out of the corners, and then take interior establishing shots all the way up to the crime scene. Do the same concept with a crime scene E&E, top, middle, and bottom, and make sure you take a good photograph of the inner floor. And then do the same concept inside the crime scene. Take a 360, overlapping, top, middle, bottom. And then as you start to identify the evidence, then start taking evidence establishing shots. Establish the spatial relationship of the evidence to fixed objects at the scene. Ensure you're not too close, because you can get closer later. Aim in the middle of the evidence and use the object you're fixing to, like use the V or the T method, and then use a 35mm lens length. So this is an example of what I mean when I say the V method. This is the method that I've taught for about 20 years. And here's what not to do with the V method. So here's another example of what I'm talking about with the V method. And again. And again. If you're establishing multiple pieces of evidence inside of a photograph, I would take this overall photograph as they have it, but then multiple items may be established together if they are part of a group and the spatial relationship is maintained. This overall is good, but I would have additionally established 1, 2, 3 as a group, 4, 5, 6 as a group, and so on. All of these bloody footprints are about the same distance apart, which shows the gait and direction of travel of the offender, which is then used to corroborate or refute testimony. So now you're going to change lenses, because now it's time for macro photography. So for a long time, I thought 60mm was basically the go-to lens. I didn't realize for much later in my career just how important macro lenses at different focal lengths are. So you can kind of see on this example I put up here is that the distance between the 60mm and the 105mm is quite large. And so the reason why I would want a 105mm lens, macro lens, is because it allows me to get the same picture, but I'm further away from the object. If you have paid attention during my earlier lectures, Locard's exchange theory is very important. And it's coming up here in a second, but PPE is fairly important during photography, especially at a critical crime scene. So if it's a murder or a sexual assault, we don't make sure that your DNA does not get anywhere in the scene. Now, because you're using a 105mm, it allows you to be further away from the object you're photographing, which causes less likelihood of you contaminating that object. So when you are using macro photography, I want you to take a photograph with and without scale. The scale should be parallel, the longest part of the object being photographed if possible. The scale should be on the same plane as the evidence. Macro lenses are good for capturing very small objects. Traditionally, they are used to photograph insects and flowers. They can also be used to capture different views of everyday subjects, as well as detail on everything forensically that we want, latent fingerprints, trace evidence, etc. The main benefit of macro lenses is that they can focus on very small objects at very close distances, enabling you to fill your frame with that object you're trying to photograph. Because these are small subjects, we just don't want to get too close. Macro lenses allow photographers to show viewers something familiar in a whole new light. So you can kind of see how close I can get to this latent fingerprint. Could I get a little bit closer? The answer is yes. And I would love to do this again with the 105mm just to see what the difference is with contemporary lenses. But as you can see, that this does pretty good. So this is a 60mm lens. So I answer the question, does the entire scale need to be visible? The answer is no, just as long as some of the hashtags are on there, because this is a scientifically accepted scale. Therefore, we know the exact measurements, and the lab can use these measurements to further enhance if necessary. Next example, these could be better, could be a little bit closer. I could also take multiple photographs at different, top, bottom, and middle. Another examples of macro photography. Fill in the frame. So close-up critical comparison. So for evidentiary items that may be compared to an unknown item by forensic scientists, like fingerprints, shoe impressions, tire impressions, bite marks, striation marks, and tool marks. So these could be a little bit better. We could have filled the frame a little bit better. The scale is down next to it. Just make sure that it's on the same plane. You don't want it to be higher or lower than what you're trying to photograph. And you also want to make sure that you don't cross-contaminate. So if you have this ruler down and it has your DNA or somebody else's DNA, you're now contaminating that area with DNA. So there's rules to remember in critical comparison. You must ensure proper depth of field while eliminating any distortion. F-stop 11 is a good aperture setting, which will allow this. Make sure that you have JPEG fine and the NEF raw photo data. NEF is basically the Nikon's raw file format. Raw images are sometimes referred as digital negatives, and they contain all the image information captured by the camera sensor, along with the image's metadata. Make sure you use a tripod, that is a must. Make sure you do it with and without scale, as I said before, and of course using the macro lens. Fill the frame, be perpendicular, and film plane parallel, and use oblique lighting if necessary. So here it is. Is PPE necessary even for photographs? And the answer is absolutely. Please, please wear PPE even though it's hot, it's cold, it's uncomfortable. You might think it's unnecessary, but you do not want to cross-contaminate your scene. Oblique lighting is often used to illuminate impressions. I use a flashlight more oftentimes, but you can also use a bounce card. You can kind of see just how good oblique lighting makes that shoe impression pop. So some common photography errors. is that there is camera movement. This person should have put this on a tripod, and it makes it shaky and unfocused. And this is a picture of a latent fingerprint. As you can see, it's not on the same plane, and it's taken at an angle, and the depth of field is wrong. And this is what I find to be most common, is that one, the image is blurry, and I hate it when an image is blurry. Two, we have to ask ourselves, if this is relevant, then if it's relevant, then why didn't we take a second photograph of this? But regardless, it's inside the crime scene, you should be taking a photograph that's in focus. So most police reports have photograph logs. They're just used as the photographer is taking notes so that he or she can testify, months or years later. And it's just a good idea to make sure that you have one available. Kind of looks like this. That way you can refer back to it when you start testifying to the pictures that you take at the scene. Just remember, you have one chance to do it right. It is critical that you are prepared for a scene. This includes the camera equipment. Never delete any photographs, because obviously the defense will have an argument with the judge if you are manipulating that one key piece of evidence that could have exonerated their client. So never delete. Just because they're blurry, it's okay. Keep them all on a disk, but then just use the ones that are not blurry as exhibits. Crime scene video is the same concept. I've used it in major cases. I used it in the 2009 Fort Hood shooting when Hassan went on Fort Hood and murdered 13 people and wounded 32. So what I did not do is that I didn't pan very slowly. I thought I was going slowly, but it was pretty fast, probably because the adrenaline was pumping. To make sure you put it on a tripod and that you either have it pan itself, which is probably a better thing, or just go obnoxiously slow. Because trust me, you think you're going slow, but you're not. And of course, turn the volume off because you don't want the comments to be heard, or you don't want crying and distractors to be heard. Okay, shifting to photographing injuries. You want to make sure that the skin is properly exposed. I want you to take several photographs with different types of lighting, which is known as bracketing. Bracketing is a technique where a photographer takes shots of the same image using different camera settings. I want you to try with and without flash. You need a tripod without the flash. Try to do a bounce flash, and then also try to do a diffused flash. Make sure to establish injuries. So I want an overall, and then work your way into the injury, similar to what you do with evidence establishing shots. And I also want you to be able to show where the injury is located on the body. That's the purpose. Also, it's good to show injury along with the person's face for identification purposes, so the defense can't argue that's not the victim. So I want you to do intervals of the injuries, 24, 48, 72 hours, and so forth. That way it shows the stages of healing, and it shows the egregiousness of the totality of the injury. And make sure that you keep the scale parallel as you can. This is an example of using bounce flash or oblique lighting to draw out the bite marks. And also photographing human remains. Try to do a full length of the body from all four sides. Establish location of the body in relation to the scene and evidence. Do a head and shoulders ID shot for the families. Do close-up injuries with and without scale. And then do other various close-ups depending on the circumstances. Just be cautious not to disrupt trace or fragile evidence. And please don't ever touch the injuries, because A, you don't want to cross-contaminate, and you don't want anything to manipulate the actual evidence. Here's an example of what I mean when I'm photographing human remains. You can see the bottom right-hand side is the ID shot. I know there's a ligature on this dummy, but what I would do is I would sensitize it. When I show it to the family, I would remove, put like a black box around anything that shows anything that's egregious. ALS, there's a lot that goes into ALS, but just make sure that you look up what you're not familiar with ALS. This is just a quick overview. Is that you must use a slow shutter speed and a large aperture. Use a filter when necessary. Use the ultralight ALS, which I'm more familiar with, manual, as a guide to using the appropriate light. It shows you how to photograph blood and semen and so forth and so forth. Here's an example of what ALS photography allows you to draw out from the exhibit. And then using the lens filters for your camera. Luminon and Blue Star is the two products that I have used so much throughout my career. So I thought I'd throw this up there because it's probably what you would use the most. So I use it the most. Make sure, again, you use a slow shutter speed. Open the aperture. ISO is about 400. Fill flash with flashlight. And have equipment ready before spraying. So have everything set up, spray, and then start photographing. Here's an example of a case that I worked where I used Luminon Blue Star. Okay, so that's it. So that was about 41 minutes of me blabbing about the basic concepts of applying forensic photography towards your scene. Now, again, I briefly covered this stuff. I want you to make sure that you review literature as well as practice before you start applying this to the field work. You can't afford to mess up because, again, this victim will suffer, and we just can't have that happen. So master your craft if this is really what you want to do. So in the next episode, we're going to do our practical exercises and then do critical comparison photographs to see how well we can do. And I challenge you to do the same thing as you watch me screw up or do good work. We'll see. Have a great day, sheepdogs. See you in the next one. Sheepdogs. Let's go.